before I turn things over to our guest speaker for today. First, I think everyone here probably knows this, but the Historical Society calendars are out at the Bank of Millbrook. Who's gotten a calendar? All right, Peter put this together this year. It's all images of historic animals. Is that the right way to phrase it? Historic images of animals, right? I'm not sure what the animals necessarily did, but Jonathan Boyce has a few that he can share with people too. If you don't normally make it into the bank, talk to him, right? He'll get you one. And the second thing, since our last meeting in November, I think everyone in here knows about David Greenwood's passing and obviously what he meant to the Historical Society. I mean, I can't even put that into words. Luckily, so many of the programs that he offered are on our website. I mean, that's a great way to honor him, to go back and watch those programs from 5 years, 10 years ago. He talked about every imaginable aspect of Millbrook history. A few weeks ago, I ran into Nan at Morona's, and I brought up the idea with her of maybe her being on the board of the Historical Society now. Because she would come to all the meetings with David. I mean, she was involved, I mean, almost as much as he was, really. And she accepted. So she's not here tonight because she's at an event at Cary. But starting in February, she's going to be joining Historical Society as a trustee. I think normally we do this in November. Because of the timing here, we just have to have a vote. So everyone in favor of adding Nan as a trustee to the Historical Society, say aye. Aye. Opposed? Okay, so that is formally accomplished. All right, thank you for doing that. Our speaker tonight, Robert Ulrich, is a retired IBMer.
Yes, sir.
Who, as he has already kind of started the program informally, right, has told you that he's inspired reading this book by Russell Shorto about the Dutch and their legacy and kind of contributions to the history of where we are right now. So I'll turn it over to him. And like you said, if questions, feel free to raise your hand.
First of all, thank you for having me tonight, and you owe it to Bill. If you don't like it, blame it on him. If you do like it, tell me. 30 years with IBM in Fishkill. Now, the plant is still there, and it's 6 different companies, including, and Tom Watson must be spinning in his grave, a beer brewery right on site in one of the buildings. And if you don't know the history of IBM and alcoholism, they were miles apart. It was quite a thing as the CEO has changed and the rules loosened up a little bit. I did some local reading. I picked up this book. I must have read a review in the paper, and it was about the Hudson Valley, and this is really a great book. I picked it up, and I've got 3 copies at home. I've got 2 soft covered, this one. I'm just going to make a statement. If you have some Dutch in you, and a couple of people are raising their hands, you're going to leave this, and aren't familiar with the book, you're going to leave this lecture tonight a lot prouder than you ever were before because of what the Dutch influence on the Hudson Valley had. America truly owes a lot to its Dutch heritage, and we don't quite realize that. You will get a better feel for it when we're finished this evening. The Island at the Center of the World. The story about the book it's a lecture in itself, but I can't skip it. There was a PhD student at SUNY Albany who got downsized, pushed out, didn't make it. You only get so many years in a PhD track to get to certain milestones, and he didn't, and they dismissed him. Downsized, terminated. He goes cross town to the museum and the archives looking for a job. And in the interview they said, well, would you do at Albany? He said, I taught 17th century German and Dutch. And they said, wow, don't go away. Stay right here. And they ran to the vault. And in the vault they had 12,000 parchment pages of Dutch records from the mid-1600s. And they pulled the page out, probably very delicately, and put it on the table and said, can you read this stuff? And he looked and he said, yeah. And then they said again, don't go away. Literally, They went running to find Nelson Rockefeller. This was up at Albany now. Empire State Plaza had just been completed. Rockefeller was embarrassed to bring foreign dignitaries to Albany. It was a ghetto. They had spent, well, you know what Empire State Plaza looks like today. All the bigwigs at the archives said, don't go away, we'll be back. And they ran to get Rockefeller, who was literally on his way to get to Washington, D.C. to become vice president under Jerry Ford after Richard Nixon resigned in disgrace. And they said, Rocky, they all knew each other. I'm glad we caught you. We got a problem. And they told him the story about this kid who could read these 12,000 pages, or so he said. And Rockefeller said, what's the problem? He said, there's nothing in the budget. Okay, we all know about budgets. And he said, what are you talking about? He said, we need $25,000. And I could just picture him pulling out his checkbook and say, I thought you were talking about real money. That was 1975. By 1995, Charles Gehring was his name, or as he prefers to be called, Charlie. I still feel guilty because of what this man has done. Charlie had translated 6,000 of the 12,000 pages, and he was working. But that's how far he had gotten when the New York Times found out about it. And they send one of their reporters up, who had a history of writing. He had written some books. I think he wrote an autobiography, a biography of Jackie Robinson, amongst other things. And he sat down with Gehring and said, let me see these 6,000 pages of translations. And he said, my God, there's a book here. And there was a book there, and that's the book. Shorto so fell in love with the whole story that he picked up his wife, his kids, and moved to Amsterdam for 5 years. He lived in the Netherlands. The book has become hugely popular. It put the Netherlands back on the map. It put Shorto on the map. He wrote the next book he wrote was Amsterdam, the most liberal city in all of Europe. Liberal, and that's the key word for tonight's talk. Liberalism is synonymous with the Dutch mystique. Okay, it's a great story, and we're going to hear quite a bit about it today. That was his second book. It took him 5 years, and then he brought everybody back home. By that time, both he and Charles Gehring had been recognized and awarded by the Dutch government. It gave the Dutch a real midlife kick. So with that said, okay, the second book I brought, probably nobody here has heard of. It's called A Description of New Netherlands. Now, a book you probably have heard of is William Bradford's Plymouth Plantation. Okay, it was a first-person description of what were the Pilgrims doing up there in Massachusetts. It was life up there. Very, very popular. This is the same type of story, but it was never translated into English until the late 1800s, so nobody ever knew about it. Since that time, it's been translated twice. If you get the book, and I think you're going to, if you like to talk, you're going to want the book, get the more recent of the two translations. The forward in this one is by Russell Shorto. Okay, it was retranslated by Charles Gehring and some other people up at the, Charles Gehring, in his work at the archives, created what's called the New Netherlands Society. That was his organization, that was his baby. And he's still up there. I often say, Charlie, when are we going to get the second book out with the other 6,000 pages? And for some reason, maybe they're not interesting, maybe it's just covering everything that was in the first 6,000. I don't know, but the book is based on those first 6,000 pages of translating from 16th century Dutch into English. I will explain in greater detail what the second book is all about. Okay, the first attorney, I don't want any hisses, the first attorney in the New World was a young man by the name of Adrian Vanderdonck. This is a prelude to the book. The Dutch government controlled very, very strongly everything from Nutten Island, we call it Governor's Island today, but it must have had a lot of nut trees on it, because that's what it was called back then. Okay, up to Albany. North of Albany, They wanted a monopoly on what was going on there. And what was going on there was the beaver trade. That was the key. And I'll explain that. Everything north of that was up for grabs. A man by the name of Kilian van Rensselaer had some connections with the Dutch West India Company and the Dutch Parliament. And he said, I want a patent, I want a manor. The deal was, you were given a grant of land, you had to develop it within, it was either 5 or 7 years. You had to bring the people over, get it farmed, get it working, and if you didn't do it in that period of time, it reverted back to the government, and they looked for somebody else who could do it. And they gave this guy something like 1 million acres. Probably most of today's Rensselaer County. And Rensselaer Polytech is not named by accident. It was Kilian van Rensselaer's footprint and fingerprint on the society up there. So that was Albany and north. That was his territory. He needed a land manager, and he hired this attorney from Leiden, this young man, Adrian Vanderdonck. Vanderdonck worked for him for a short time, got disenchanted with the job, and took the boat ride down to Manhattan to fight with Peter Stuyvesant for the rest of his life, and he died prematurely. I'll explain what happened. Probably he was at the wrong place at the wrong time. Let's go get started. And because this is a history group, it's going to be long enough, and I apologize for that, but you're free to leave whatever you want. There's no lock on the door. I added about a 3-minute philosophy lesson about history that I don't often cover. Depends where I am. I don't know if that's the screen or we're losing a little bit at the bottom. But memorable quotes, and all of these quotes have to do with something historic. Confucius had a one-liner about history: study the past if you would define the future. George Wilhelm Hegel was a real cynic, maybe frustrated. His comment was, the only thing we learn from history is that we learn nothing from history. Okay, and I will tell you, being a student of the Revolutionary War, taking part in the Vietnam War, okay, the British had the same problems 250 years ago that the Americans had fighting 8,000 miles from their supply base. Okay, we just keep making these same mistakes, fighting another nation on their own land, just like the British coming over here. We learn nothing from history. This one's crazy. I am sure this group knows the quote, and I'm pretty positive, unless you've really done some deep digging. Anybody recognize the name? Carr? Critic, journalist, mostly a journalist. I don't know where he borrowed that robe. His famous quote, in its French, plus ça change, plus c'est la même chose. Okay, which we all know as the more things change, the more they remain the same. And then one from our own Give 'em Hell Harry, President Truman, said very simply, there's nothing new in the world except the history that you didn't know. This one is interesting because not a lot of us will recognize the picture. I had to do some digging. This is a 1936 cover of Time magazine. George Santayana. Turns out, Santayana was obviously his birthplace, and I'll show you why I know that. He was not born here, and when he died, he edicted that he be buried literally any place other than here. He hated capitalism. He was educated in the Boston schools. He was a philosophy professor at Harvard University. But he never changed his views on socialism and communism. Oh, this is why I say Jorge Agustin Nicolas Ruiz de Santayana y Boras. So Santayana was one of the cities that was part of his upbringing. Those who refuse to learn from history. Everybody knows the second line. Out loud, come on.
Are doomed to repeat it.
Are doomed to repeat it. And now you know who said it, and you've seen the picture of George Santayana. Again, any questions, ask them as they come up. Let's not wait till the end. What we're going to talk about tonight, and that book, 40 years from start to finish. That's all the time the Dutch had before the English realized we really screwed up. The English were down in the tobacco colonies, Virginia and Carolinas. Those were the Church of England, Anglican British. Then the Pilgrims and Puritans came over into New England. That today is the Congregationalist form of Protestantism, quite different than the Anglicans. The Anglicans, I've got a 60-second religion course. The Church of England, the Anglican Church of England, is Catholicism without the Pope. And if you look at their traditions and the vestments and the cathedrals, it is, in fact, the Catholic Church. In fact, when King Henry VIII couldn't get that divorce, he said, forget it. You're the Roman Catholic Church. I have now started the English Catholic Church. It was his daughter who decided when the Reformation was taking hold, let's rename it, okay, and that's when it became the Anglican Church of England. But very little changed. So the Anglican Church is Catholicism without the Pope. Coming over here, it was very, very difficult for an Anglican to be a patriot, because in your Sunday service was a prayer to the health of the king. They petitioned for a bishop over here, and they couldn't get one. They finally sent a preacher over to England to get ordained as a bishop. The last part of the ordination was to swear allegiance to the king, and he said, whoa, you don't know why I'm here. I'm here because I got to go back without that requirement. And they said, well, you're in the wrong place. So he did the only thing a smart guy could do. He went north to Scotland. And he said, will you ordain me as a bishop? And they said, absolutely. Okay, and that's when he came back as Episcopalianism. So just very simply, the Anglican Church of England is very, very Catholic, but no Pope. The Episcopalian Church here is Anglican without the King of England. Okay. The Dutch experiment was almost over before it started. 40 years, the British realized we screwed up. We just ignored that piece of land in the middle. But look what the Dutch have done with it. And we will learn, sailed in and took it back from the Dutch. That's the introduction. We're going to talk about Henry Hudson. We're going to talk about Vanderdonck's book, A Description of New Netherlands. This hemisphere's first attorney. Dutch words we use today. The significance of the beaver trade. Dutch gifts to America. Dutch liberalism. And its mark on America. And this is really the most significant piece of the whole evening. The English come in, push the Dutch, not out. Things were working much too smoothly. They said, pay your taxes, swear allegiance to the king, and you certainly can stay. And if time permits, and you're not going to want to miss it, ho, 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 it turns out Santa Claus is a Dutch invention. Have any of you ever gone up to Rhinebeck on the Saturday closest to December 6th? December 6th is the saint's day for St. Nicholas. Santa Claus, same guy. And they have a great, this was the first year that it has not gone over. They ran out of funding. But they opened up the town to parades and parties and sales and this and that, celebrating St. Nicholas Day. Okay, we're going to learn about that. 2 of Santa's reindeers were Dutch. This is the book that got me started. I'm going to cheat because some of this I'm probably going to want to look at and read. The 2 creators, Russell Shorter, we've spoken about, and Dr. Guerin, Charlie. Russell came up twice into this area. He gave a book tour at Marist College, and this was, I'm looking at the staircase, this was the book tour he did at Dutchess Community College. I am a groupie. I wanted his autograph. And secondly, besides Shorto, the second most important guy, who to me doesn't get enough credit from Shorto, although his picture is in the book. I can find it for you later. Oh, there it is. That's it. Charles Gehring. Shorto described that picture of something out of a Bruegel painting from the Dutch Golden Era. June 19th, 2010. My God, almost 15 years ago. Here I am in his office, introducing two key figures in the book. Peter Stuyvesant, the last of the 5 governors of New Amsterdam, the most successful of the 5. And his nemesis, a young attorney from back home, Adrian Vanderdonck, the first attorney to arrive in New York, was working for Kilian Van Rensselaer as the land manager, sheriff, justice of the peace up on those 1 million acres north of Albany. This is an interesting cannon, unlike anything I've ever seen. It was literally almost a breech-loading cannon, but this is at the Museum of the City of New York on Museum Row in Manhattan. That cannon was dug out when the original World Trade Center Foundation was created. They found that land, because that's exactly where the fort that was part of New Amsterdam was located, and it was just a piece of garbage, okay? Obviously outdated as the years went on, and they just buried it. Over on the wall, look at those 2 paintings, and those are Vanderdonck and Stuyvesant. Who started the adventure to the New World? It was the trade history. The quick story, the Ottoman Turks closed the Silk Road, especially to Europeans. Okay, they had had enough of the Crusades. They said, we don't want your business anymore. Go find a different way to get to India. Go find a different way to get to Africa. Now, that was a simple way to find it. You go sail all the way down Africa and come back up again. It took you months to do that, and it also caused you to have to sail outside off of the coast of Spain and Portugal, who would not that infrequently take your boat and all of its treasures as their duty. 1453, Constantinople falls. Everybody knows the song Istanbul was Constantinople, and that's when the name changed. The merchants of Venice no longer could travel over the Ottoman lands. New trade routes are needed. The Portuguese did sail around Africa to the Spice Islands, and the importance of sea trade was realized. 1602, the Dutch East India Company is formed. The Dutch government was not stupid. They didn't want people losing time and losing money by fighting and competing. So they created legalized monopolies. The Dutch East India Company was a legalized monopoly. Fully recognized by the Dutch government, they had trading rights. Nobody could trade beaver pelts between Nut Island and Albany. It was off the table. Caused a lot of disagreements with some of the French traders coming down from New Canada. Didn't matter, okay? But legalized monopolies. The Dutch, and also they wanted them to form their own army. And before it was all over, the Dutch government literally had 3 armies. They had their government army, they had their East India Trading Company army, and they had their West India Trading Company army. The East India Company was formed 1602. The stock market is invented. The first company to issue publicly traded shares. And the whole concept of the stock market was born. If you owned a trade ship and put your whole fortune into that ship, and it went down in a storm, or was taken by pirates, you were out of luck. But what they started was the concept of, well, why don't you buy 2% of 50 ships? If one of them goes down, you still have 98% of your investment. It's like a share of stock. That's the same concept. And that's what created and started the stock company. The company dominated global trade for 200 years. 20 years later, 1622, the Dutch West India Company is created. sugar from Brazil, silver from Peru, and furs, especially beaver pelts. Beavers, by the way, had been hunted to extinction in Europe. They didn't exist. And yet you needed them to make the finest of the fine hats and the fine capes. You needed beaver pelts. They didn't have a source of it. All of a sudden, they found them here. The Dutch create a world financial system. The Bank of Amsterdam is formed in 1609. Key date, that's also Henry Hudson's key date. The Dutch introduced a system of debits and credits, the first check writing against a bank account. That was Dutch. They began minting coins of uniform weights and standard values, so uniform and so standard that the Dutch florin became the world's most desired currency because everybody trusted it for its content and its value. 12-year truce for Spain. When you're fighting, you can't be playing games, exploring, or creating. They had a 12-year truce for Spain, and the truce for Spain is significant. Part of the Habsburg Empire included the lowlands, the Nederlands in Dutch. Lowlands, Nederlands. Think about the name of the country today. They were ruled by Catholic Spain. The Spanish saw the Reformation starting and told the leaders of the Netherlands. Prince William the Silent, a famous story. I heard the name, I thought maybe he had a speech defect. He didn't have a speech defect at all. He was invited to a meeting of the Spanish king and one of the high-ranking French officials, both Catholic. And at that meeting, they were talking to him about what was he going to do about eliminating all of the non-Catholics in this country. And he didn't say a word. He didn't say a word until he went back home. He was so upset about that request. They called him the Silent because he didn't say a word, but he did convert to the Calvinist Dutch Reformed religion. There was a huge fight. There was a war. The Netherlands won. They got their freedom from Spain. They had an issue, not a problem, but an issue. The southern half of their country was very, very heavily still Catholic. And they said, well, we've got a simple answer. That's now called Belgium. Okay, it was a bloodless kind of separation. We'll stay up here, you go do your thing down there. So it worked. But in this 12-year truce, they could concentrate on commerce. Manufacturing flourishes. All classes of civilians got involved in producing trade goods. The Dutch controlled timber from the Baltics, salt from France, spices from the East, sugar from Brazil and the West Indies. And the salt, interesting sub-story, I teach another program called Tidbits and Factoids of History. Salt was an incredibly valuable commodity back then because there was no refrigeration. And salt was used for preservation of meat products. Roman soldiers were paid in a salt ration often because they could trade that salt in any town they were at for whatever goods they needed. The Latin word for salt is sal. The payment to the soldiers was their salary. And the expression, is he worth his salt? Okay, are we paying him too much? Is he worth his salt? It all comes from the value that salt had at the time. 1621, war with Spain resumes. They had to protect their trading interest in the Western Hemisphere. And that's when the Dutch West India Company came into being. Its mission, carry out that war against Spain in the Western Hemisphere and the Atlantic Ocean. Company stock is now sold internationally, and now the Dutch West India Company is authorized to have their own army and navy. Imagine Walmart with an army to protect its shipping. The Dutch now have three military forces. Trade prospered. Fur pelts once again were available in Europe, the finest hats and coats. South American sugar and salt trade flourished. The sugar from Brazil, even to this day, I think Brazil produces 40% of the sugar of the world. The Dutch became, by 1648, the greatest trading nation in the world. Now independent of Spain, they had a fleet of over 10,000 mercantile trading ships. They controlled over 50% of all European commerce. But now I want to back the clock up 24 years. The first Dutch settlers. There were explorers here before. Have any of you been to Cape May, New Jersey? Cornelius May, Dutch explorer. Have you ever been off Rhode Island to Block Island? Adrian Block, Block Island. But now volunteers were being brought over, the people that were going to work the land that was given to the wealthy guys who were able to get their manors, their patroons, to settle, to populate. 1624, the first Dutch settlers, 30 families, mostly persecuted Protestant Walloons who were living in Catholic territories where they weren't very nice if you weren't Catholic. 12 of them stayed in New York Harbor. The other 18 were brought by Peter Minuet up to Fort Orange. Fort Orange, today we call it Albany. Albany, when you think about it, was the intersection point of America's first two superhighways. What am I talking about? Everything that had to travel fast went by water. The Hudson River intersects with the Mohawk River. Now let's see if I have it here. Yes, okay. If you could get to the Mohawk River, you could get to Lake Ontario. If you could get to Lake Ontario, you could get to all the Great Lakes. If you could get to all the Great Lakes, you could get to the Mississippi. Okay, it's not an accident that this is now the path of the New York State Thruway. It's also was the path of the Erie Canal.
And it's the 200th birthday of the Erie Canal this year.
Pardon?
It's the 200th birthday of the Erie Canal this year.
Interesting, okay. And remember, we're coming up on the 250th of the Revolution. 200 years later, not by accident, the Erie Canal was built incorporating the Mohawk River pathway. New York State was then, with the opening of the Erie Canal, opened for business. And that's when it became known as the Empire State. Here's a piece of geology. This is an actual contour map of New York State. These are the Catskills, these are the Adirondacks. There's nothing over here. That's where the Mohawk River flows. That's why the New York State doesn't go over any mountains. That's where they built it. And I asked a geologist friend of mine, I said, why is that flat? I did remember reading that there are places along the New York State Thruway where if you dug, you'd come up with fossils, fish fossils, seashells. And it turns out that during the last glacier age, there was a huge, huge lake formed around here. Enormous. The glacier went down, and went down about as far as midway through Long Island, and then it stopped and started melting. It melted and melted and melted, but up north, the St. Lawrence was still plugged up like a cork. That lake was formed and it broke loose. And the Lord only knows how strong it was, but it took the land down to sea level. It must have been a huge gush over a huge period of time. You can do a lot of things if you're given a couple of million years. So, all right, so we're talking about how significant. Once you got to the Mississippi River, everything in red here is a river or a stream that will connect you eventually with the Mississippi River. So you can see how important it was. And once on the Mississippi, you got to the Great Lakes, you could get to Buffalo, you could get to the Mohawk River, you could get to the Hudson River, you could get your goods to Europe if you needed, and then back in the other direction. The Dutch left their mark as they settled west of Albany, and even to this day, if you look at a map heading out towards Buffalo, any way of adjusting the zoom, I can't do it here. But what we're looking at is Rotterdam and Amsterdam, our cities in New York. Think about where those names came from. The local natives did not like these 18 families that these 18 Europeans that Peter Minuet brought up. They didn't feel comfortable. They said, get them out of here. And Minuet said, look, can I leave a couple of soldiers here to protect the traders? And they agreed, and the rest of them got back on board the boat, heading back to New York. Halfway down, they passed the Esopus Creek, the Esopus Inlet to Kingston. And they said, you know, this looks like good farming land. And they got out, and they settled. And it was until 1850 that the records, the legal records of Kingston, stopped being maintained in Dutch and went to English. But that's the mark that the Dutch made in the Esopus and Kingston area. The rest returned down to Nutten Island. Here it is, probably 3 times bigger than it was when Peter Minuet was there. And Minuet realized, he said, this place is not big enough to what I've got planned. I got to go find out who lays claim to this big, big place, which the Algonquins called Manahata. Manahata in Algonquin means hilly island. And you don't understand unless you've been up to St. Nicholas Park and really northern New York City, or walking through Central Park and seeing some of those hills. When the grid went in 1812 or so, everything got flattened, houses had to be brought back to street level. But before that time, the Indians named it appropriately Hilly Island. Minuet struck the bargain of the century, the centuries. This is in Dutch, I don't expect you to read it. It's called the Schongen Brief. It was written by Peter Schongen. It was a report back home to his bosses. And in this paragraph, you could see you could see the word 60 here.
60.
In English, yesterday, the ship Arms of Amsterdam arrived here. It sailed out of the river Mauritius on the 23rd of September. The report that our people in New Amsterdam are in good spirit, live in peace. The women have also borne some children. They have purchased the island Manhattan from the Indians for the value of 60 guilders. That was the value of the trinkets that were used in the trade. Who gets credit for starting it in the first place? Let's talk about Henry Hudson. Is it Henry? Is it Hendrik? Is he Dutch? Is he English? Let's take a vote. Who thinks Henrik Hudson was Dutch? Who thinks he was English? He was absolutely English. Which bugs me because down in Westchester they have Henrik Hudson High School.
Yeah.
That wasn't his name. His name was Henry. Because the Spanish and Portuguese were attacking trading ships heading south, it was critical to find a way over the top of the world, the Northwest Passage. He was hired by a British company called the Muscovy Company because they had some dealings with Russia. In 1607 and 1608, he took 2 voyages trying to find the Northwest Passage. He failed. He failed, they fired him. The Dutch found out about it and they said, go get him, we will get him a ship. And they purchased a ship. In fact, the contract, quote, we will find a suitable vessel between 25 to 35 tons in which the Englishmen can sail. Wasn't a very big ship, crew of 16, half were Dutch, half were English. Hudson didn't speak Dutch. He had a translator. His pay about $320. Today it would be worth a lot more than that, 800 guilders. He got 150 guilder advance, a full-size replica of the Half Moon. Did anybody see this when it was sailing on the Hudson River? Okay, a gentleman put together this ship. It was a full, authentic model of the Half Moon. He couldn't keep it financially solvent. He sold it to a museum over in the Netherlands. In 1989, Dr. Andrew Hendricks was the guy who owned it here. Here it is docked at Kyle Rock Park, Poughkeepsie Bridge. Okay, and it was for real. Now working for the Dutch, this was the 1609 voyage, Hudson set sail again to find the Northwest Passage, and again he failed. And he said, I'm not going home. Guys, we're going west. I know there's something there because the English have set up a colony down in Virginia, Jamestown. His first mate, Robert Jewett, Hudson's notes were never found. They were never found because the English government took them when the ship made the mistake of landing back in England before they went back to the Netherlands. And they were really upset that this Englishman had discovered lands for the Dutch, and they probably grabbed his book. But nobody realized that Robert Jewett, his first mate, was making notes. And this is Jewett's writing. It's a beautiful land. He details trading with the natives. Isn't this interesting? These are three of the tribes he was dealing with. The Manhattans, the Rockaways, the Canarsies. Those were Indian names long before they were places in Brooklyn or places in Queens. These were Native American tribes. Hudson logged, I said, were never recovered. His first mate, Jewett, kept detailed notes, all dating to 1609. September 4th, this day, the people of the country came aboard, seemingly very glad of our coming, and brought green tobacco, gave it to us for knives and beads. They go in deerskins, well dressed. They desire clothes and are very civil. We went on land to walk on the west side, he's in New Jersey now, of the river. We found good ground for corn and other garden herbs with a great store of goodly oaks and walnut trees and chestnut trees, yew trees, trees of sweetwood in great abundance, and a great store of slate for houses and other good stones. He continues, this is a very good land to fall in with, a pleasant land to see. The country is full of great and tall oaks. That must have opened up the eyes of the British, because most of the tallest trees in Europe have been cut down to make masts for all of the Navy sailing ships. And look where they established their home once they moved off of Northern Island in this place that they then named New Amsterdam. Does this shape look familiar? They decided to keep the New Englanders out, and they built a wall. The street next to the wall is named Wall Street. That name hasn't changed today. It's the same place. This is the original, what did the Dutch society look like in Lower Manhattan. South of Wall Street, built not to keep the natives out, but to keep the English Connecticut people out. A wooden wall erected along the line, which today still has that same name. Jewett had called the New Englanders a lithe, slippery, aggressive race, whom the Dutch looked upon half in fear and half in scorn. Here's what the wall may well have looked like. The invasion from New England never took place. The wall remained for nearly 50 years and succeeded only in keeping the town from growing any further than that wall. Although there were estates and farms up here, okay, but certainly not the building that we saw down in this area. In fact, Peter Stuyvesant's estate, they don't call it Stuyvesant Town in Manhattan for no reason. That's where Stuyvesant lived. That was where his farm was. Do you know the Dutch word for farm?
Boerderij.
Boerderij. Bowery. Except they spelled it with a couple of W's and J's. They had a soft J. We're going to talk about that. But it was Stuyvesant's Bowery. That was Stuyvesant's farm. I'll show you a picture of it in a minute. This is really interesting. This is how Manhattan has grown through landfill. If you can imagine how much junk dirt from subway construction would be valuable. A couple of square feet of property right here. Open up your pretzel stand or your hot dog wagon. Okay, this is everything. This is what it was in 1650. There it is in 1800. There it is in 1905. There it is in 1980, which is probably when Battery Park City went in. All built on landfill. This is interesting because that was the original New Amsterdam. Vanderdonck and his book. Description of New Netherlands. Vanderdonck wrote the first sales manual of the new lands over here. It was to interest the people back home in the Netherlands, get over here, because otherwise the British are going to beat us all to it. which they eventually ended up doing. Vanderdonck had been hired by the Dutch diamond merchant, I told you the story, Kilian van Rensselaer, 1,000 square miles he controlled north of Albany. He was to serve as the land manager, sheriff, prosecuting attorney to keep things running smoothly. He filled all three roles. His book was a summary of everything that he saw around here. Everything. He was bright. He was an attorney, number one. But he must have been a botanist, he must have been a biologist, because he took notes. That's what the book is based on. The book was written in 1655. And what you're reading is a first-person account of what this area was like in 1655. And as I say, it wasn't translated into English until late in the 1800s. It was a sales manual to try to get people in the Netherlands interested enough to come over. These are some of the chapter headings. Where is New Netherlands situated? New Netherlands was all of this, from Albany down to Nut Island. New Amsterdam was today's New York City. Why is this territory named New Netherland? The Dutch first possessors, the limits, how far they extend. Most interesting, and I found this most interesting, he has a whole chapter devoted to a conversation he was having with a native. Either the native was talking Dutch, or most probably Vanderdonck learned the Indian language. The original natives of New Netherlands. And if you could read it, it says, this is the chapter title. Okay, I don't know how to correct the zoom on, do you know how to correct the zoom on the projector?
Not easily. Not easily.
It's not there.
No.
Okay, that's all right. In any case, this chapter is headed of the manners and extraordinary qualities of the original natives of New Netherland. And take a look at, these are all conversations he was having. They get into the bodily care of medicine, of their money and manufacture. They didn't have money, but they used, we call it wampum. The real name is Ceylon beads, to trade in beads. The Indian description of how human beings first came to their country, what they thought about. Ways of burial, lamentation, ways of marriage and childbirth, relations of men and women, special account of their hunting. This is amazing. And you're talking about something written in 1655. Translated 50 years ago. Moving on to the significance of the beaver trade. It all started with beavers. Does anybody, and there's a beaver head right up here. Anybody recognize this piece of terracotta?
Astor Place.
Wow.
Subway.
Get 2 desserts, okay. Astor Place. Take the Lexington Avenue local and get out at Astor Place. I'll show you another picture. It all started with beavers. This was a picture sent back to Europe of what life of a beaver was like. It's called the hunting of beavers. In Latin, Acacia del Castori. Castori was the Latin word, or the Italian word for beaver. Acacia is house, the house of beavers. And you notice they had 3-level condos at the time. This is what Europeans were being taught of. This is what a beaver lodge looks like, if you could take a cross-section. Obviously not true. And you see the Indians now using muskets to go shoot them, kill them, skin them, and trade it back. Everything was barter back then. There weren't coins being used. Everything was barter in terms of beaver pelts. But this is what the Europeans were told. Life of a beaver. This is how they lived. Barter was everything. This is up at the museum up in Albany. Gunpowder, muskets, rum, lead for bullets. Okay, all had values in beaver pelts. 40,000 pelts in the high year of 1656. The beaver image is prominent in all the shields of both New Amsterdam and New York City. Starting with a street named in their honor, even to this day, down in the financial district is Beaver Street. The street's preserved as part of New Amsterdam street grid. New York City is a New York City designated landmark. The beaver appears in the New York City shield. Okay, there he is, there he is. The windmill was down next to the fort, down at the base of Manhattan, and these were probably barrels of wheat. I doubt that they were gunpowder. This is the shield of, yes, question?
Was that any derivative from any of the Dutch that were there, the New York City shield? Like, did their coat of arms derive into the city?
Well, this is the shield of the Dutch, of the New Netherlands Company.
Oh, so they were...
Okay, this is the shield of the New Netherlands Company. In fact, it says Signia Novi Belgium. Remember I told you about Belgium before. Novi Belgium, New Belgium. This is the seal of New Belgium. This is the royal monarchy, Dutch monarchy, and look who's centered. And this, by the way, is a string of Ceylon beads, of wampum beads. John Jacob Astor made his second fortune in real estate. His first fortune was in fur trading. A visit to Astor Place, underground on the Lexington Avenue local. Get out of the train and look who's sitting on the wall. You still can't see his head. Okay. There he is. You can see it. Remember how Astor made his first fortune? He even set up a trading post in Oregon on the westernmost coast of the Columbia River was his trading post. And a town to this day. Do you know the name of that town?
That's the story.
Oregon is the only state in our union that has a flag with two sides. Because if you turn it over, look what's on the back side of the Oregon flag. Bartering with pelts, this is a memo from one of the Van Rensselaer sons in the upper Hudson Valley. He's writing home to his dad, the beaver trade may turn out to be very good, for almost all the river Indians are out hunting. 1659, Johann von Rensselaer. Trade goods were converted into beaver pelts, 3 skins for a gun, 2 skins for 8 pounds of gunpowder or 40 pounds of lead, 6 skins for 6 quarts of rum. Leading to a sad story. Shorto mentioned, we all know, most of us know, alcoholism is a terrible curse on a lot of the Indian reservations. The natives knew about grapes. They knew about making grape juice. They never ever knew anything about fermenting it into alcohol. That was a gift given to them by the Europeans, who used it for a lot of different reasons, and one of them was to make great land deals, because they would get the local Indians drunk, sign some deeds, and all of a sudden they now own a lot of property for an embarrassingly small rate. There was no word for being drunk in the Algonquin vocabulary, because nobody had ever been drunk. They didn't know how to get drunk. These are some lithographs of the era. Okay, one entitled, "The Indians Bringing Beaver Skins to the Fleet," waiting to start their trading process. Without the beaver, there would have been no Fort Orange, no New Amsterdam, and probably no New Netherlands. Just a minute or two on the beaver. This is what a beaver lodge looks like. And here they are working on their dam, damming up a stream. The beavers are incredible, really incredible. 2 amazing engineering feats. They build a home that has no above water level entry. Their water level is underwater. It's not underwater when they're building it, but they know that there is a stream nearby. And not only do they know how to build a home, they also know how to build a dam, and when to start building the dam, and how to control the water level of the dam. I laughed, they can't get into Home Depot because of that no shoes, no service policy, so they had to do it on their own. This is the water level of a beaver lodge. They're living up here. This is how they get in and out. If something happens to the dam, there's a dam on the Vassar College property, Vassar Farms property, And every once in a while, one of the docents, if you're on a tour, they'll pull a couple of logs out of the dam. And if you wait long enough, okay, you'll see them coming out, because they notice the water level's going down in their lodge. And they send the boys out to go figure out what's leaking. And they will then get the wood needed, find the hole, and patch the dam. The beavers fought back as best they could. Too little, too late. Okay, just didn't have enough. As a college mascot, now there are 3 interesting colleges that have probably a lot more, but 3 that come to mind. CCNY, New York City. Is it not surprising at all that the beaver is the mascot of CCNY? But more significantly, does anybody recognize, oh, this is the college ring from CCNY. And 40 years ago, that was a beaver right there. It's been worn down. My friend loaned me his ring so I could take a picture of it. I skipped too quickly. This is the college ring of the most prominent engineering school of America. That is the college ring of MIT, giving credit to nature's original engineer. And not to lose credit, okay, there is an MIT of the West Coast. What's the great engineering college on the West Coast?
Caltech.
Look at their mascot. Okay, Caltech calls MIT the Caltech of the East Coast. Anyway. 1840, silk replaced beaver fur for the finest of furs, and the beavers were no longer a hunted species, but they had almost been hunted again to extinction. Remember that quote from Hegel, okay? What do we learn from history? We learn nothing from history. And places that used to be prominent with beavers never had them again. And it was about 15 years ago that they celebrated in the Bronx, sighting the first beaver living in the Bronx River. It hadn't been seen for hundreds of years, so the beavers were returning. Dutch words we use today. Any questions on beavers and such? You may not realize you're talking Dutch. This is an interesting story. I used to work for a friend of mine who had a little local touring company. She would take out-of-town guests, and her package was, we will tour them through the Hudson Valley. And I was on one of those bus tours. As a guide, I made sure they got on and off at the right spots, and we got to lunch okay. But this one woman from Kansas said, why, and what's this story about these homicidal Dutch? And I said, what are you talking about? She said, well, we got to JFK, we get in the bus, we're driving up here, we come to Peekskill, and then we come to Fishkill, and tomorrow we're going to Catskill. Anybody know what we're talking about?
Reverse.
The Dutch
Creeks.
word for stream, body of water is a kuur, okay? So those are all places. Peekskill is Jan Peek's stream. Fishkill is a stream that has fish in it. Eleanor Roosevelt's place, okay, is Valkill. I have the list here, okay. Small streams running throughout the state. Just pulled the map out and took a look. And if that's not enough, try these on. Okay, this is Valkill, Illinois Retreat, Stony Kill, Spackenkill. Everybody here know of Spackenkill over near Poughkeepsie? There is a sign on Route 9, northbound, as you go under the Spackenkill overpass. Before you get to Giacomo's Pizza, before you get to Barnes & Noble's, New York State history marker. I've driven by it for 45 years. 5 years ago, I decided to stop and read it. There's no place to park. I had to park at Giacomo's and walk back. And what it says is interesting. It says, Speck, Zin, Kill. There was an Indian on that property whose nickname, I thought it was his name, whose nickname was Speck. That was his stream. That property was called Speck Stream. Speck, his stream, Speck Zin Kill. Say that fast 10 times, and you'll eventually come up with Speck and Kill. And I sent that note up to my friend in Albany, Charlie Gehring, who is my Dutch expert and friend. It doesn't take him 20 minutes to get back to me. I said, Charlie, look what I found. And he writes back, he said, that Indian must have loved bacon. I said, what are you talking about? Now remember I told you he taught 17th century Dutch and German. The Dutch word for bacon is speck. So this was old Mr. Baconhead. His name was Wampazak, but his nickname was Speck, and that was his stream. Just another one of my tidbits and factoids. Dutch names in our landscape, okay. Why did I go back? The 6 towns of Long Island, Brooklyn. The topography of this little village on the coast of what today is the East River looked very, very much like the topography of a place back home that had broken up marshy land. They called it Brooklyn there, they called it Brooklyn here, and that's where the name Brooklyn came from. Bushwick, Dutch for town in the woods. Vlakkerbos, settled in 1634, Dutch for wooded flatlands, became Flatbush. You can understand how close the Vlakkerbos and Flatbush sound. Gravesend is Count's Beach. It's down near the Verrazano Bridge. The Brooklyn shoreline near the Verrazano Bridge. New Utrecht is named after Utrecht, a city back home. Midwood, called Middle Woods. Some others you may recognize. Vlissingen, nobody knows it by Vlissingen. That is today Flushing in Queens. Konya Island must have had a lot of rabbits, because Konya is the Dutch word for rabbit. And that's where Konya Island got its name. Haarlem, very well to this day famous city back in the Netherlands. In Upper New York City was Haarlem. Jan Key, remember that soft J? We're going to talk about it again. A very common Dutchman's name was Jan Key. New Yorkers became Yankees. Okay. Baseball team changed the J-A-N to a Y. But Jan Key was what, if you didn't know somebody's name, you just said Jan Key, and it was like Bill or Tom or Bob. If you have ever been on a yacht and spoken to the skipper, you're already talking Dutch. Those are both Dutch words. So you didn't even know it, but you knew Dutch. I call this one my double header. This is by the Ansville traffic circle on Route 9 as you get to Peekskill. There's a sign that gets you up to Fishkill. There's a sign that takes you down to Peekskill. And the notice, the historic marker that says this was the site of Jan Peek's trading post. And the stream there, that was Jan Peek's Kill. Here's the sign. Named to commemorate the place where Jan Peek, a Dutch trader, met Indians to trade for furs. That was Peek's stream. A stoop, a small porch, platform, leading to the entrance of a house. The Dutch often had to build their houses a floor up because they were so low. A lot of the Netherlands is below sea level, with the water being kept out by the dikes. So because of all of that water, they tended to build homes like they do in the coastal Carolinas, where the garage is under the house and the house is built on stilts. So when the next couple of hurricanes hit, it won't all get washed away. Middle Dutch stoop, small porch, or a step. Broadway was originally called Breedweg. It's still called Broadway to this day. Remember him, Vanderdonck. The governor that preceded Stuyvesant was a man by the name of Wilhelm Kieft, and he was the wrong man for the job. He was a reprobate. He was an alcoholic, a reprobate. He ended up starting a war with the natives. Now the natives were the trading partners of the Dutch. They could not afford to fall out of good terms with these people. The French, by the way, up in Canada, they sent traders over. They grabbed their own animals, they trapped them, skinned them, etc. Here, The Dutch just brought goodies over. Kettles, pots, pans, guns, gunpowder. Okay, they used that to trade. The Indians went out and did all the gathering of the beavers and producing the beaver pelts. Vanderdonck ended that Indian war that Kieft had started. And in gratitude for that very significant occurrence, they presented him with a piece of land. That land extends from Van Cortlandt Park to Croton, New York, where the train station is. We call it Westchester, New York today. In the middle of Westchester, he set up 2 very successful mills. He was never be royalty, but he certainly wasn't poor, common man any longer. He was solid, middle class. In England, he would have been called a gentleman squire. The Dutch didn't have the word squire. They had a different word, soft J. They had a Jonkheer. And Vanderdonck became a Jonkheer. People would say, I'm going up to Vanderdonck's mill, I'm going up to visit the Jonkheer. Take the J-O-N, change it to a Y, just like the New York Yankees, okay? Okay, that's where the word, that's where, Yonkers was where his mill was located. Our kids come home, we know we're not British because if we were, our kids would come home to milk and biscuits. They don't, they come home for milk and cookies. Okay, cookies. Cookie is the Dutch word for little cake. We use duffel cloth, we carry a duffel bag, and in the Netherlands, here's Paddington in his duffel coat. This is a statue in duffel in the Netherlands. Okay, there's another Dutch word, Cape May. I told you about Cornelius May. Adrian Block, Block Island. You don't work for a master unless you're English. You work for a boss. If you're Dutch, we call him a boss. That's why he's a boss. But in England, he would be your master. Staten Island, interesting piece of land. It's the first big piece of land you see coming in off the ocean. It really belongs to New Jersey, but New Jersey didn't exist. So it was incorporated into New Amsterdam. In honor of the bosses back home, the parliament, it was called the Staten General. They named that island States Island. Staten Island is States Island. When the British took over, they renamed it. It's now called
Richmond.
Richmond. Who calls it Richmond? We still don't use that word. Hey, Brooklyn's not Brooklyn. Officially, it's Kings County. We don't use that. The English changed a lot of the words. We didn't. Okay? We're still speaking some Dutch.
And New Yorktown.
Yorktown,
No, New York County.
New York County. Oh, New York County for Manhattan. That's right. I forgot. They don't even use the Indian Manhattan. Okay, the official name of that island, okay, is New York County. You're absolutely right. Named after James II, okay, the Duke of York was given the property by his brother King Charles II. And then they renamed New Amsterdam, New York. Brooklyn, settlement of 1636, named after the Dutch city of Brooklyn, anglicized to Brooklyn. Until it merged with New York City, Brooklyn was the second biggest city in all of America. The area of the Lower East Side, called the Bowery, was the region just north of the Wall. Farm in Dutch, look how they spell the word Bowery. Okay, again, a soft J, Bowery. There it is. That Bowery farm, that was Peter Stuyvesant's Bowery. Okay, he was north of the Wall. Okay, he had his estate north of the Wall, Governor Stuyvesant's great Bowery or farm. This is an interesting drawing. Look how they spelled New York. Again with the soft J, 1673. Dutch gifts to America. This is kind of interesting. So many we never even think about. The games we play here today depicted in Dutch art hundreds of years ago. Bowling is as old as the ancient Egyptians, a staple of 17th century Dutch culture. Henry Hudson's crew brought over a form of lawn bowling green down in Lower Manhattan. Guess what that was used for by the Dutch? Ice skating. The Dutch invented the precursor to the modern ice skates.
Bob, you missed one of the most important words from Dutch that we use.
I'm sorry?
You missed one of the most important words from Dutch that we use.
What's
The reason we don't have pounds for our money. Our money is dollars.
Thalers. I don't know if that was Dutch. It may have been German. Thaler. T-A-H-L-E-R was the thaler, which we then renamed the dollar. It was kind of like German Dutch. Which brings me to the next one. Everybody knows about the Pennsylvania Dutch. There are no Dutch in Pennsylvania. Okay, these were the Hessian soldiers that stayed here after the war. They were the Pennsylvania Deutsch. Deutsch was the German word for German. Those were the Pennsylvania Deutsch. Everybody misinterpreted what they were talking about. We now call them Pennsylvania Dutch. They weren't. They were the Pennsylvania Deutsch. Ice skating was introduced to North America, a sport considered proper for all classes. This is some old Dutch artwork. Okay, all the canals would freeze over in the wintertime. This is called Skating Fun by Hendrik Averkamp. He did a lot of winter scenes. During the freezing cold winters, New Amsterdam's residents would skate over to their neighbors in the village of Brooklyn, along with another very popular sport in America today. Okay, look closely. Take a look at what game they're playing. Ice golf. Okay, the painting is dated 1625 for all of you golfers that thought it was invented in Scotland. And this name of this painting is A Game of Golf on the Ice, 1620, again by Averkamp. So very many children's games. Some of them 450 years old. Very famous Dutch painter, Peter Bruegel. This is a self-portrait of Bruegel and his chief sponsor. This was Mr. Moneybags, who was a financial supporter of Bruegel. A couple of Bruegel's most famous paintings, the Tower of Babel, Adoration of the Kings, the Peasant Wedding, and the Return of the Hunters. One that's not so famous is really more interesting. Children's games. If you take a close look at this painting, you will see 80 different activities. Okay? Including hoops and rings, Johnny on the pony, riding the barrel, pole play, leapfrog. A lot of them are kids' games today. The Dutch Golden Age, the period of truce, the time with the truce of Spain, a 10-year truce with Spain, a great time for the arts to flourish. On the book cover here we see the famous Lute Painter by Frans Hals. This is another Averkamp painting. Winter landscape with skaters. This is, who was it again? Vermeer. Vermeer's Milkmaid, a self-portrait of Rembrandt. All those yummy baked treats. We eat cookies, not biscuits. They were first created to test the oven temperature before the housewife would know it's time to start the bread. Children would line up for them in the kitchen. Only then did the real cooking, pastries and cookies begin. Cookies, spelled differently, is a Dutch word. Koekje, little cake.
So you should have cookies before dinner.
It would take a
Because
while
they
for the...
prepared the oven.
Interesting. The other way the housewives would test the temperature of the oven, they would stick their hand in to see if the hairs would curl. Okay, and then they knew it was hot enough to bake. This is a book in the archives of the Culinary Institute, The Verstandene Cook. And in English it means The Sensible Cook. This is part of the Culinary Institute library. The book was translated by local historian Peter Rose. Donuts, pancakes, waffles, pretzels. The Dutch loved their baked goods. Ship's inventory showed that a lot of people packed their waffle irons with them when they came over to this continent. It was not just pastries. Here's what the modern translation looks like and what it contains. The Sensible Cook, translated by that Peter Rose, and to my surprise, there she is. Okay, they named their daughter Peter. She's the one who did the historic translation of the cookbook. Thought widely to be a German creation, coleslaw is simply an Americanized version of Dutch kool salad or cabbage salad. Mayonnaise had not yet been invented. The cookbook contains a recipe for making this cabbage using melted butter, vinegar, and oil, which is pretty much the way they make mayonnaise these days. Moving on to science, Anthony von Leeuwenhoek, inventor of the simple microscope, for the first time could enlarge samples up to 200%, discovering the existence of previously unknown microscopic organisms, including bacteria never before seen or known, named them animalcules, which is Latin for tiny animals. And last but not least, 4 very special Dutch gifts. Probably won't recognize this. Anybody know who this is?
Commodore Vanderbilt?
Say it.
Cornelius Vanderbilt.
Absolutely, Cornelius Vanderbilt. Shipping magnate who then switched to railroads, creating the New York Central Railroad. His great-great-great-grandfather, Jan Harrison, was a Dutch farmer from the village of De Bilt in Utrecht. Vanderbilt means from De Bilt. Emigrated to New Amsterdam as an indentured servant in 1650. Cornelius became one of the richest men in American history with his roots in the shipping business, which leads to his nickname, the Commodore, still the mascot of Tennessee University, which he and his wife endowed. They took a small teacher's college in Tennessee, threw a huge amount of cash at it, and as will be done when you donate a building to your alumni, whatever, they will name it after you. It's now Vanderbilt University, and there's where Utrecht is, where the Vanderbilts came from. This is Frederick Vanderbilt, one of the grandsons, up in Hyde Park. And believe it or not, this is not a permanent residence. This is just a change of seasons. They had their mansion on Fifth Avenue. They had their cottages in Newport. There were 4 Vanderbilt cottages in Newport. The Breakers was one of them. One of them is a Catholic school, Virginia Shelley, I believe is the name of it. This is a brother of Frederick, Hyde Park's Frederick, down in Asheville, in Carolina. Okay, the Biltmore. 805 rooms, supposed to be the biggest house in America. But that's only one of that's 2 of the French, Dutch gifts. FDR, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, Rose Fields. And even more Dutch, as we call FDR's uncle-in-law, who's Eleanor's uncle, was Teddy. And here's a guy who couldn't even speak English until he was 8 years old and went on to become the 9th president of America, Martin Van Buren. Another gift. Okay, on a very important note, another thing that made America, America, Dutch liberalism. Perhaps the greatest legacy that the Dutch left with us. It was always part of their DNA. We were lucky that they brought it over with them. It all started a long time ago in the most progressive government in all of Europe. Look at the history of the Pilgrims. This is an interesting story. We all know the Pilgrims came over and landed in Massachusetts in 1621. They got thrown out of England 12 years earlier. Okay, the English did not like them practicing their form of Protestantism. 1593, the English passed the Act Against Puritans. They had to bail out. They abandoned England after the passage of that act. Where did they go? They did not come to America. They headed for Leiden in the Netherlands. The Netherlands had no persecution, no religious issues whatsoever. You could practice any religion that you wanted in the Netherlands, and wait until we get to literature what you could publish. Okay, they would not intervene with it. The interesting thing is, why did the Dutch leave after 12 years? Okay, take a look at what the New Englanders are wearing. Okay, they're all wearing Dutch-looking clothing. And I said to my friend Charlie, I said, Charlie, why are they all wearing Dutch clothes? He said, after 12 years, you gotta go shopping, don't you? So they were buying Dutch clothing while they were still in Leiden. That was what they were coming over with. That was how they knew what clothes were. Okay, the Pilgrims left Leiden after 12 years because they didn't like the liberalism that was starting to impact their children. They said, this is too liberal. We need a place where we're not going to be interfered with at all. They came over here not for religious freedom, but literally for religious exclusion. They didn't want to be bothered. All other oppressed peoples headed for the Netherlands, some of them quite wealthy. Netherlands was not sorry to see businessmen come in and set up their businesses here. Protestants fleeing oppression by the Catholics of France and Spain took refuge in the Netherlands, not unlike the Huguenots of New Paltz fleeing to America and settling here. As for the press and publishing, no censorship. You pay, we'll print. No government censorship of England. How liberal? 50% of all the literature in Europe was published in Leiden in the 17th century. Descartes, French, took refuge there. His discourse on method was published in the Netherlands because of its famous one line, I think, therefore I am. That was heretical. Galileo published mathematics in Leiden. Here's the cover of the book. Mathematics, Galileo, Galilei. And down at the bottom here, it says published in, okay. My apologies, you'll have to see it here. In Leiden, 1638. Rights for women. This is really very, very interesting. In France, in England at the time, when your husband should die, if you didn't have a good relationship with your eldest son, who inherited everything by law, you were thrown under the bus. Women had no inheritance rights in France and England back in those days. You did in the Netherlands. You could own land. You couldn't own land as a woman in England. Not just all ages, all genders, not just males as in England, but women also. In this hemisphere, New Amsterdam became the world's melting pot. American author Kane Heinowitz writes, Dutch fur traders, English merchants' sons, random fortune seekers from Spain and Norway, Welsh tavern keepers, Gaelic blacksmiths, religious dissidents, and a smattering of Jews and free slaves somehow managed to conduct business, even while speaking 18 different languages. Over the next 200 years, the arrival of starving, war-ravaged, oppressed, or just plain restless, huddled masses, almost all of them from Europe, turned New York into the largest and most diverse colony in America. Back home, the Dutch government had discovered that religious tolerance was good for business, as religious refugees with money to invest fled to the Netherlands. The Flushing Remonstrance in 1657, Peter Stuyvesant, strict Calvinist, outlawed the practice of all religions other than the Dutch Reformed Church, the established Church of the Netherlands. This resulted in numerous acts of religious persecution, harassment, and as much as he hated non-Calvinists, he really despised Catholics and Quakers. The Quakers picked up and left and ran for Long Island. Okay, they fled out of Vlissingen. Remember I said Vlissingen today is Flushing. Stuyvesant found out about it and went out there to arrest them. The English neighbors of theirs, weren't Dutch, wrote a remonstrance. A remonstrance was the formal document that you use to make a complaint to the government. They wrote it, I've got, if not a picture here, oh, I do have a picture of it, and signed it and sent it over to the Netherlands. And the Netherlands government came back and told Stuyvesant, let these people be. Okay, they're not doing any harm. Out in Flushing, John Bound had married a Quaker minister, female, interesting, female ministers, and said, you can use our house for your meetings. That was the scene of the crime as far as Stuyvesant was involved. 1657, the remonstrance was sent over. 30 Englishmen signed it. It's still important today, 355 years ago. A picture of the actual document, and you can see the signatures of the locals. Back in 1911, there was a huge fire in the brand new library and archives in Albany. It trashed more than a million Iroquois Indian artifacts were gone. And it trashed some of those 12,000 pages of Dutch that were so ignored by the British, they just kept piling junk on top of it, which is the only reason that Goering didn't have much trouble with the first 5,000 or 6,000 pages, because they hadn't been fire damaged. This is now getting down in the pile to the stuff that was hit by it, or getting up in the pile, the stuff that was impacted by the fire. This is a picture of what that New York Capitol fire took in 1911. 12,000 parchment pages, some of them were saved. The fire was devastating, but the charge of remonstrance was saved to this day. And here it is again. And this is what the local English was saying about their neighbors to the Dutch government. If any of these said persons come in love unto us, we cannot in conscience lay violent hands upon them, but give them free egress and regress, entry and exit into our town. And the Dutch government agreed and told Stuyvesant, step down, let them be. They're not harming you. Stuyvesant was ordered to allow everyone to have his own belief as long as he behaved quietly and legally. This is the Dutch government talking now, and gave no offense to his neighbors and did not oppose the government. Russell Shorto calls this one of the foundational documents that led our founding fathers 100 years later to write the First Amendment into our Constitution. Freedom of religion, freedom of speech. Our First Amendment states Congress shall make no laws respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof or abridging the freedom of speech or of the press. But we can thank the Dutch 100 years earlier for giving us the idea. Today, within a few blocks of the Bound House, this is Russell Shorto writing, a visitor will encounter a Dutch Reformed church, a Quaker meeting house, an Episcopal church, a Jewish synagogue, a Catholic church, a Hindu temple, a Muslim mosque. All these religions coexist in peace in the most diverse neighborhood, in the most diverse borough, in the most diverse city on the planet. To summarize what the Dutch left us, it all started with the Dutch. Look at 4 of our most prized institutions. Oh, this is really wild. 4 of our most prized institutions all started not with the British, but with the Dutch. These might also deserve credit in that article where I pointed out Dutch gifts to America. The Dutch had a public school education system. Everybody got an education for free. You pay taxes. The British didn't practice that. Our freedom of religious worship, we just learned about it here. In England, if you weren't an Anglican, even the Presbyterians left England to come over here because they passed laws. If you weren't Anglican, you could not be in the government, you couldn't teach, you couldn't be a lawyer. It was called the Test Act. You had to pass the test in order to get into one of those professions. Our freedom of the press, we just learned about that. Our freedom to vote by secret ballot was Dutch, not at all English. We take them for granted today, as always having been there. Not one of them came from England. None of them even existed in England when they were established here in America because it was part of our Dutch heritage. It took from 50 to 100 years before being practiced here in America, before they were even adopted in England. And it was thanks to the Dutch that they ever started here at all. These all came to America directly from the Dutch, not the English. Just as significant to you ladies was the making of inheritance rights applicable to females and all heirs, not just the eldest male. English law for 200 years until they finally passed the Married Woman's Property Act of 1870. That was yesterday, okay. Dutch control comes to an end. The English take over. The government was paying to trade out and sail out of Manhattan. They saw the wealth that the Dutch were bringing back home. They sent over what was supposed to be a peace overture, but it was a small navy. They came in. Colonel Richard Nichols is sent over with 4 gunships, 150 sailors, 300 soldiers, and they tell Stuyvesant, you better move over. You don't have to get out, but you better move over. Stuyvesant was in a bind because probably a third of all the people here weren't even Dutch. They were all of these immigrants who had came here for freedom, and they were not going to die fighting for the Dutch. Stuyvesant made a quick trip, as quick as you could be back in those days, back home, and he said, we can't do anything about it. They said, go ahead and do what he says. Stuyvesant asked them, can I stay? And they said, just pay your taxes, swear allegiance. But if you don't, and if you light that cannon, look at those people on the border by Wall Street, that wall, these were all the New Englanders who were waiting for it to be declared an open city, where they could then go in and ransack and loot and steal and rob. It never happened. Resistance would be futile. 1/3 of Stuyvesant's citizens weren't even Dutch. They gave up. 13-day standoff, it's hopeless. He surrenders the Dutch holdings, returns to Holland for instructions, and they told him, you did what you had to do. He comes back and asks for permission to stay. Can I keep my estate? And he's still there to this day. He's buried in St. Mark's Church, down in the Bowery. St. Mark's in the Bowery. Just a couple of blocks from that Astor subway station. A scholar assesses the impact. This is Russell Shorto. The Dutch brought their tolerance and their aggressive free trading sensibility. When the English took over, they saw that the island was functioning like no other place in North America. They kept things more or less intact. Both New York and America were off to a great start. And finally, with Christmas just over, the Dutch invented Santa Claus. I won't spend too much time. It was after St. Nicholas, Bishop of Myra. Myra exists to this day in Turkey. Asia Minor, I guess we would call it. This is his tomb. This is St. Nicholas's tomb. This is an ancient depiction of what he looked like. And the gifts hanging by the fireplace. The little girl is getting good little things, and the little boy is crying. And look what he's holding, because his stocking is holding nothing but birch sticks. This is from a Dutch painting. Look at that smile on her face with a new doll. Okay, and as far as that young man is concerned, he probably found a piece of coal in his shoe. Why are gifts appropriate? The story of the Bishop of Myra is interesting. Back in those days, as a young unmarried girl, if your family could not provide a dowry, you were not marriageable. You would never get married, which meant you would end up in some very seedy commercial business, okay? It wouldn't be pleasant. The tale goes, the bishop came by this one house that had not one but 3 daughters, and he had 3 bags of gold with him just for this occasion, tosses the gold bags in. There are stockings being dried out on the mantelpiece, and 1 stocking, 2 stockings, 3 stockings. They now had 3 dowries. The 3 daughters could get married off. That morphed into a couple of things, including the gift giving. But it also morphed into St. Nicholas is the patron saint of several different professions. Bankers of northern Italy, brewers, merchants, archers, pawnbrokers. Take a look at today's pawnbroker sign. You look at the 3 bags of gold right there. And I thought this one is cute. Okay, even Rudolph's sled pulling buddies show their Dutch heritage. Donder is the Dutch word for thunder. Blitzen is the Dutch word for lightning. St. Nicholas was so important to the Dutch, he was considered the unofficial patron saint of New Amsterdam. In Inwood, New York, northern Manhattan, okay, we have St. Nicholas Avenue. We celebrate on December 25th. No, the Dutch celebrated St. Nicholas's death date, December 6th. That was when the Dutch parents would give their children presents. They would all go to school in their new clothes with their new toys, and the English kids were so envious that the powers to be went to the Dutch leaders and said, you know, this is creating a little turmoil. Would you push the gift giving off to December 25th? But Rhinebeck, to their credit, still celebrates December 6th, the Saturday closest to December 6th. This was from a few years back. This was up in Rhinebeck on December 6th. This is St. Nicholas coming in off the river by horseback. The locals up there go nuts. They really do a beautiful job. Okay, and the image changes. This is a visit from St. Nicholas, 1881, Thomas Nast. Coca-Cola enters the scene. Not really all that different. Okay, a couple of years between them. The more things change, the more they remain the same. Another quote we went over an hour or so ago. Time to wrap things up. Let's look back quickly. Where have we been? Told you the story of Henry Hudson. We learned about Adrian Vanderdonck, an inscription of New Netherlands. The significance of the beaver trade. Dutch words we use to this day. Yacht, duffel, skipper, boss. Dutch liberalism, probably their greatest gift to us. The English took over, and Santa Claus. Time's up. Let's end the talk with a Dutch goodbye. Vaarwel. Goodbye to all our Dutch roots, but maybe first, let's have a cookie. Thank you. Thank you. I'll open it up for questions, if there are any. No question? Oh, question.
Hi, thank you very much. I have to confess, I thought I was coming to